64 missiles. That's the number that may have just rewritten the rules of modern naval warfare. At 3:47 a.m. local time, Iran launched what analysts are already calling the largest coordinated missile attack against American naval forces since World War II. Not a single strike, not a warning shot, a fully coordinated barrage. 64 ballistic and cruise missiles. 3 separate waves. 17 launch sites spread across Iran's southern coastline, every one of them aimed at the same target, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group, operating just southwest of the Strait of Hormuz. To understand how serious this moment is, you have to understand what an American carrier strike group represents. For decades, U.S. aircraft carriers have been the ultimate symbol of military dominance. Each one is essentially a floating airbase, capable of launching dozens of combat aircraft while surrounded by a protective shield of destroyers, radar systems, and layered missile defenses. The Eisenhower Group was protected by exactly that kind of shield. Advanced radar tracking systems, Aegis missile defense, escort destroyers equipped with interceptors designed to destroy incoming threats long before they reach the carrier itself. In theory, this defensive network is one of the most sophisticated ever built. But theory and reality are very different things when dozens of missiles appear on radar at the same time. According to early reports from U.S. Central Command, the launch detection systems triggered almost immediately after Iran fired the first wave. Radar operators began tracking incoming objects moving at extremely high speed toward the fleet. Within seconds, defensive systems activated, missile interceptors launched, electronic countermeasures engaged. Every ship in the carrier strike group moved into a defensive posture. But the attack itself had been carefully designed to overwhelm that system. Ballistic missiles descending at steep angles from high altitude, cruise missiles flying low across the surface of the water, multiple directions, multiple trajectories, all arriving within a narrow window of time. The goal was simple: saturate the defenses, force the American fleet to deal with dozens of simultaneous threats, and increase the probability that some would slip through. And within minutes, the situation escalated from a potential strike to a full-scale engagement in the Persian Gulf. Then came the American response. Just 14 minutes after the first launch warning, at 4:01 a.m., U.S. Central Command authorized a counterattack. The operation was given a name, Operation Thunderstrike. Almost immediately, the first phase began from the Gulf of Oman. The guided missile submarine USS Florida launched a volley of Tomahawk cruise missiles targeting Iranian missile launch infrastructure along the southern coast. Not long after that, B-2 stealth bombers launched from Diego Garcia began striking Iranian air defense installations. And within the hour, F-35 fighter jets from the USS Abraham Lincoln joined the operation, hitting command centers linked to Iran's Revolutionary Guard. This was no longer a limited retaliation. It was the beginning of a large-scale air campaign. But here is the part that changes the entire story. Despite the massive American defensive network surrounding the carrier group, Iran's attack did not completely fail. Several of those 64 missiles actually broke through the defensive shield. And that single fact is now raising a very uncomfortable question inside the Pentagon. If an American aircraft carrier can be hit, what does that mean for the future of naval warfare? Because here is the detail that changes everything about this story. The Iranian attack did not completely fail. According to early satellite imagery reviewed by multiple defense analysts, at least 7 of the 64 missiles fired by Iran actually penetrated the defensive perimeter of the Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group. 7. That number might sound small compared to 64 missiles. But in the world of naval warfare, it is enormous. Carrier strike groups are built around layered defense systems designed specifically to prevent exactly this scenario. And yet, several missiles still got through. Let's break down what we know so far. First, the carrier itself. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower was hit by at least one missile, Initial reports indicate the impact occurred on the port side of the flight deck toward the rear section of the ship. The carrier is still afloat. It remains structurally stable. But flight operations have been suspended, and that matters more than it might sound. Aircraft carriers derive their power from the aircraft they launch. If the flight deck is damaged, those aircraft cannot take off, which means the carrier temporarily loses its most important capability, projecting air power. Early damage assessments suggest the impact also affected part of the carrier's upper superstructure. Even more concerning, the ship's primary radar system appears to be offline, forcing the carrier strike group to rely on backup systems to coordinate air defense. Now consider the second confirmed hit. The USS Nitsa, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer that was part of the escort formation protecting the carrier, was also struck by a missile. Reports indicate the ship sustained significant damage and may be taking on water. Although it remains under its own power and continues operating with the rest of the fleet, 3 additional missiles reportedly struck support vessels traveling with the strike group. Damage assessments are still ongoing, and the Pentagon has not yet released a full casualty report. But the larger issue here is not just the damage. It's the implication. Because the defensive network protecting this carrier group includes the Aegis Combat System, one of the most advanced naval defense systems ever developed. It took decades to build, roughly $12 billion in research and development, and it has served as the backbone of American naval defense for nearly 40 years. Its purpose is simple: detect, track, and destroy incoming missiles before they ever reach the fleet. Yet in a single engagement, at least 7 missiles slipped through. Now, that doesn't mean the system failed completely. In fact, intercepting the majority of 64 incoming missiles is an extraordinary defensive achievement. But modern warfare isn't measured by percentages. It's measured by consequences. If even a handful of missiles reach their target, the results can still be devastating. And this is exactly why military planners worry about saturation attacks like the one Iran just launched, because even the most advanced defense systems in the world have limits. And once those limits are reached, the balance of power at sea begins to look very different. But here is where the situation becomes even more dangerous. Iran did not stop after the first strike. Instead, within hours, Tehran made it clear that this confrontation was only beginning, because just hours after the first missiles struck the carrier group, Iran made something unmistakably clear. This was not a one-time attack. It was the beginning of an escalation. At 5:34 a.m. local time, Iranian state television abruptly interrupted its regular programming. The broadcast cut to a live appearance from Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and that alone was unusual. Khamenei rarely appears live during active military crises. In fact, analysts say it's the first time he has done so during a direct confrontation with U.S. forces in decades. But what mattered most were his words. Standing before the cameras, Khamenei declared that the Islamic Republic had struck the heart of American imperial power. He said the missile barrage had proven that no foreign fleet could threaten Iran without consequences. Then he issued a warning that immediately sent shockwaves through military commands across the region. If the United States continued its aggression, he said, every American base in the Middle East, every Allied installation, and every military vessel operating in regional waters would become a target. And that warning was not just rhetoric. Within 30 minutes of that speech, Iran launched a second wave of missile attacks. But this time, the targets were different. Instead of striking the carrier strike group again, Iranian missiles were aimed at American bases across the Gulf region. Multiple installations reported incoming missile alerts almost simultaneously. At Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, one of the largest U.S. military facilities in the Middle East, defensive systems were activated immediately. The same thing happened at Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates and at Camp Arifjan in Kuwait, a key logistics hub for American forces in the region. Patriot missile batteries engaged. Terminal High-Altitude Area Defense Systems known as THAAD also activated to intercept incoming threats. Initial reports suggest that several missiles were successfully intercepted, but not all of them. Early indications suggest that at least 2 missiles penetrated defensive systems near Al Udeid. Thousands of American service members are stationed at these bases. Yet as of this moment, the Pentagon has not released any official casualty numbers, and the silence coming from Washington is beginning to raise serious concerns among analysts watching this situation unfold. But missiles striking ships and bases are only part of the problem, because while these attacks were happening in the air, something else was happening on the water. Iran's Revolutionary Guard naval forces began deploying fast attack boats across the Strait of Hormuz, dozens of them. Small, fast vessels designed specifically for swarm tactics against larger ships. At the same time, Iranian diesel-electric submarines reportedly left port and began moving into the Gulf. Unlike nuclear submarines, these smaller diesel submarines are extremely difficult to detect in shallow waters, and they are perfectly suited for one mission: ambushing ships in narrow maritime choke points. Meanwhile, coastal anti-ship missile batteries along Iran's southern shoreline were placed on full alert. Taken together, these moves signal something very specific. Iran is preparing for the possibility that this conflict could expand dramatically. And more importantly, Tehran appears to be positioning itself to do something that could trigger a global economic shock, closing the Strait of Hormuz. And if that happens, the consequences won't stay in the Middle East. They will reach every country on Earth. And this is where the crisis stops being just a military confrontation and becomes something far more dangerous, because the Strait of Hormuz is not just another stretch of water on the map. It is the most important oil choke point on Earth. Every single day, roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil supply moves through that narrow passage between Iran and Oman. Tankers carrying crude from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Iraq all pass through that corridor on their way to global markets. If that shipping lane closes, even temporarily, the consequences would be immediate, and the markets are already reacting as if that scenario is becoming real. When Asian trading opened just hours after the missile strikes, Brent crude oil surged dramatically. In the span of a few hours, prices jumped at a speed rarely seen outside of full-scale wars. Energy analysts are now warning that if tanker traffic through Hormuz is disrupted for more than a few days, oil prices could skyrocket. Some forecasts are already mentioning numbers that would have sounded unthinkable just weeks ago: $200 per barrel. And that single number would ripple through the global economy almost instantly. In the United States, it could push gasoline prices toward $8 per gallon. For trucking companies, diesel costs could rise so high that transporting goods across long distances becomes economically unsustainable. Supply chains would begin to break down. Food prices would rise again. Air travel costs would surge. In other words, the economic shock wouldn't stay confined to the energy sector. It would spread through nearly every part of modern life. And the financial markets are already showing signs of that fear. Stock futures in the United States plunged overnight. The Dow Jones futures dropped sharply, triggering volatility limits designed to prevent panic selling. The S&P 500 and Nasdaq futures also slid dramatically as investors rushed to exit riskier assets. Meanwhile, shipping companies whose vessels depend on safe passage through the Gulf saw their stock prices collapse in early trading. Insurance markets reacted even faster. Some major insurers have already begun suspending new coverage for ships traveling through the Persian Gulf and surrounding waters. Without insurance, most commercial vessels simply cannot operate, which means even the threat of conflict can be enough to halt global trade through the region. At the same time, investors began moving money into traditional safe havens. Gold surged to record highs. Government bonds saw massive inflows. This is what financial analysts call a flight to safety. when investors begin preparing for the possibility of a major geopolitical shock. And right now, the signals coming from those markets are unmistakable. The global economy is bracing for a crisis. But here's the problem. Even as markets panic and oil prices surge, military planners in Washington are facing an almost impossible strategic dilemma. Because from this point forward, every option carries serious consequences. Because at this moment, the United States finds itself facing a strategic dilemma with no easy solution. On one side is escalation. If Washington chooses to intensify the campaign, destroy more missile sites, target Iranian military infrastructure, and expand the airstrikes deeper into the country, it might eventually degrade Iran's ability to launch large-scale attacks. That is the theory behind Operation Thunderstrike. Overwhelming force, rapid air superiority, and sustained pressure designed to cripple Iran's missile capabilities and restore deterrence. But here's the problem military planners already understand. Iran's missile network is not concentrated in a few vulnerable bases. It is spread across hundreds of locations, mobile launchers that can relocate in minutes, underground facilities built deep inside mountains, hardened bunkers designed specifically to survive conventional airstrikes. Even if the United States destroys a large percentage of those launch systems, Iran could still retain enough capability to continue launching retaliatory attacks, and Pentagon war games have already examined this exact scenario. According to simulations conducted over the past few years, a sustained air campaign might degrade 60 to 70% of Iran's missile infrastructure within a month, but it would not eliminate it. Iran could still launch anti-ship missiles, still threaten American bases, and still disrupt shipping through the Persian Gulf. In fact, one projection from those simulations suggested something even more alarming. If the conflict escalates, the probability that Iran attempts to close the Strait of Hormuz rises dramatically. Some estimates put that probability as high as 94%. 94. And if that choke point closes even for a short period, the consequences would extend far beyond the battlefield. Oil shipments from the Gulf would stall. Energy-dependent economies in Asia would face immediate shortages. Manufacturing supply chains would be disrupted, and global markets could slide into a severe economic downturn triggered not by financial collapse, but by the sudden absence of physical energy supplies. But the alternative option facing Washington is not much better. De-escalation, choosing restraint, attempting to negotiate while missiles are still flying. Politically, that option carries its own risks, because absorbing a direct missile strike against an American aircraft carrier without delivering a decisive response would send a powerful signal to allies and adversaries alike. It would suggest that even the most heavily defended U.S. naval assets can be attacked with limited consequences. That kind of perception could reshape military calculations across the world. And that is why the situation is so dangerous. The United States is caught between two paths: escalate the conflict and risk triggering a regional war that destabilizes the global economy, or pull back and risk undermining decades of deterrence built around American naval power. Right now, the missiles are still flying. American cruise missiles are striking Iranian targets. Iranian ballistic missiles are targeting bases across the region. Damaged ships remain at sea. Military casualties have not yet been fully counted. The USS Eisenhower is still afloat, but its flight operations remain suspended. The Strait of Hormuz is now effectively a contested zone where commercial shipping has nearly stopped. Oil prices continue climbing. Gold prices continue climbing. Stock markets around the world are bracing for chaos when trading opens. And somewhere in Washington, the president is preparing to address the nation. The decisions made in the next 72 hours could determine whether this crisis ends as a limited confrontation or becomes the opening chapter of a much larger war. Because moments like this rarely stay contained. And once conflicts reach this level of escalation, history shows that events tend to move faster than the leaders trying to control them. The attack has already happened. The retaliation is already underway. and the entire world is now watching one of the most dangerous military standoffs of the modern era unfold in real time.